Hey guys, it's Andrew from Global Associates. Today I'm going to give a presentation on net zero operation carbon. It was by CIBSE and it was brought in September 2024. Kind of slipped through the net, but there's a lot of really important points to kind of cover. So without further ado, let's dive in. So CIBSE's net zero is guidance, the operational carbon is guidance on how to achieve net zero emissions in buildings, while the UK's net zero target, right, so this is the government's UK net zero target, it's legally binding legislation, so backed by law. Let's focus a little bit on that net zero UK target. So it was first introduced in 2029 and the UK was the first major economy to legislate for net zero. We have a series of policies for greenhouse gas emissions, and they include net zero strategy in 2021 and powering up Britain, the net zero growth plan in 2023. What were the targets to reduce? The target for the UK, reduce emissions by 80% by 2050, and they were compared to 1990s levels. Reduce emissions by 78% by 2035. So just those additional 15 years, just an additional 2%, but the majority of it up to 2035 have to be up to 78% at minimum. Achieving a clean electricity by 2030 and ending the sale of fully petrol and diesel cars by 2030. Host of technologies that are being introduced specifically in the UK is investing, right, for capturing and storing CO2. And we're also planning, and the UK rather, is planning to plant many trees to try and offset those emissions. So what's the difference between the UK net zero target and CIBSE's net zero operational carbon? Well, UK net zero, like I said, is legislation backed by law. CIBSE's net zero operational carbon is guidance. But the two do intermingle in the sense that I think if you look at the way how the government put out the information, it's usually lots of technical specifications, difficult to kind of understand for the average Joe. What CIBSE have done is they've kind of brought it down to a much bite-sizable and understandable overview of what you need to do, or some level of guidance on how you can start to implement the changes needed to hit your targets as a building owner or estate owner. And they produced a really nice infographic, right? So there's 5 key tenets to this. There's the low energy usage, there's the measurements and verification, there's reducing construction impacts, low carbon energy supply, and the zero carbon balance. So let's dive in. So look, by 2030, and these are the guidance, all new buildings must operate at net zero to meet our climate change targets. And this means by 2025, all new buildings will need to be designed to meet these targets. And this sets out the approach to operational carbon that will be necessary to deliver zero carbon buildings. There's a whole host of people who've been involved in this, groups, different entities, and there's lots of different information that can be found via these different corporate entities in this. So let's start with low energy use. So what CIBSE have come up with is the EUI, which is the energy use intensity. It's a measure of kilowatt hours per square meter per year. Now for residential properties, that value, right, so just make a mental note of what I'm covering. So residential, schools and commercial offices, that doesn't include all the rest of the building types, but let's just stick with this for a second. 35 kilowatt hours per square meter per year for gross internal area for residential, and for non-domestic buildings, so the DEC, which is essentially like an EPC, but with the DEC they are using data as it's growing. So if you've got a year's worth of data, they're actually looking at that data rather than a forecasted model like something like CIBSE, sorry, not CIBSE, my apologies, like something like LEED, BREEAM, EPC. These are all ratings that forecast rather than use actual data. So looking for a DEC of a rating of a B or higher can be achieved, or an EUI, which is the total energy use intensity, which equals or less than 65 kilowatt hours per square meter per year for schools, or 70 kilowatt hours per meter square per year for net lettable area, right? So within a tenanted area within an office, or 55 kilowatt hours per square meter per year for gross internal area for commercial offices. We'll cover those in a bit more detail in a second in the notes, but the building fabric piece is really important, right? So, in this instance, for the heating, what CIBSE and this net zero operational carbon is suggesting is that no more than 15 kilowatt hours per square meter per year for all building types. So if you take, the net lettable area of 70 kilowatt hours per meter squared, of that 70, 27% of that is already used for your heating, which essentially leaves the remaining for lighting, lifts, anything that uses consumption in a building. So what that kind of gives you a mindset of is this idea that for heating and fabric particularly, if you're in a well fabricated building and the heat losses are minimal, then it's going to take you less energy, right, or less kilowatt hours per square meter to heat that building, because the heat gets retained. In a warehouse, as an example, that's going to be a lot more challenging, right, because in a warehouse you're going to have a lot more heat losses, therefore a lot more heat being brought into the building for that type. So moving forward, specifically for new builds, the kind of fabric and makeup of that building is going to be absolutely key. Measurements and verification. So look, annual energy use and renewable energy generation on site must be reported and independently verified in use. So not just expected, but actual usage each year for the first 5 years. This can be done on an aggregated and anonymized basis for residential buildings. Now, in terms of quantifying and forecasting and stuff like that, we do all of that within our platform. I've covered our platform in length. I'll put a link to in the description for you to go and review that, so you can kind of make sure that it tallies up with what we're kind of discussing here. And then reducing construction impacts, right? Another key one, embodied carbon. What is embodied carbon? It's the carbon that gets created for the manufacturing of a particular building, right? So you may have a building where you're really efficient and you've done everything. You've put regenerative technologies on site. However, the embodied carbon comes from the practices and manufacturing processes of things like cement, bricks, sheet metal, panels, anything that glass panes. If these companies that are building those buildings on your behalf on the construction phase are not net zero compliant, then that's going to go against you on your ability to reach your net zero, right? It has an effect. And so, moving forward, that will be captured, but also kind of, putting it out there about making sure that you're validating the construction phase, sitting down with the construction team and the architects and the specifications, that they are aligning to those construction. It also includes things like, transport, so transportation to and from sites and things like that. There's a lot that gets covered in this embodied carbon piece. I'm not going to cover it all today, but just to kind of give you a highlight of it's in the mix. Low carbon energy supply. You'll see the heating and hot water should not be generated using fossil fuels is emboldened. It's a big one for them, right? Moving away from fossil fuels and moving over to electric. The average annual carbon content of the heating supplied, which is measured in grams of CO2 per kilowatt hours, should be reported. Again, in terms of managing and reporting this, our platform will do both grams, kilograms, and tons of CO2 in terms of being able to qualify your kilowatt consumption against your tons, kilograms, or grams of CO2. And we use the UK government-backed factors for both for electricity, gas, and water. They're issued once a year, and we make sure that we are tied into that. On-site renewable electricity should be maximised. Energy demand response and storage measures should be incorporated, and the building's annual peak energy demand should be reported. So that piece is an interesting one. That is really about things like firm frequency response and fast frequency response, in terms of being able to, if you have things like battery technology where you're storing energy and we have a big demand on the grid, if you're able to release that stored energy, that's going to obviously have a really good impact in terms of you offsetting your electrical consumption off that grid, specifically for meeting those demands. Zero carbon balance, kind of leading off from that, a carbon balance calculation on an annual basis should be undertaken, and it should be demonstrated that the building achieves a net zero carbon balance. The idea that you will be taking some level of consumption off the grid, unless you are complete off-grid site, which majority of buildings are not going to be. So there's going to be some offtake of energy. How can you offset that? Well, obviously there's things like solar, wind, battery storage, which can all be sent back to the grid, or a reduction in reliance on the grid. And then moving into the second point, if you can't offset that balance and you have a nominal amount that you're still overreaching, then you can do things like buying additional renewable energy capacity off-site. So things like solar farms as an example, or wind generation farms, where you can buy direct for them via things like a 15-year renewable energy power purchase agreement known as a PPA. Green tariffs, though, are not robust enough and does not provide additional renewables. REGOs, right? These are things where you buy a green tariff, but the problem is it's very difficult to know if that is being bought at source, so directly from inverters, say from a solar generation, or if it's part of already accrued electricity. So it gets really messy and muddy. So my sense here is that what they're saying is that will no longer be applicable for you to claim net zero if you are just buying if you're on a green tariff. It's too difficult to track. Just some key notes. So energy use intensity. So this is how they've kind of come up with those targets, right? The above targets include all energy uses in the building, regulated and unregulated, as measured at the meter, and exclude on-site generation. We talked about that before. They've been derived from: number one, predicted energy use modelling for best practice, a review of best performing buildings in the UK. So they will have obviously surveyed and looked at a lot of these buildings to get to that figure of 35 for residential, 70 for net lettable area, and 65 for gross internal area for schools and for commercial offices. So there are buildings already achieving this clearly if they've got to that point. And preliminary assessment of the renewable energy supplies for UK buildings. They are likely to be revised as more knowledge is available in these three fields. So they're kind of getting to a point where they understand the buildings well enough to make some assessments, but things are constantly improving. So these targets could reduce over time, who knows? As heating and hot water is not generated by fossil fuels, this assumes an all-electric building until other zero carbon fuels exist. So kilowatt hour targets are the same as kilowatt hours electrical equivalent. Once other zero carbon heating fuels are available, this metric will be adapted. So again, kind of not making it up as they go along. That's not the right terminology, but taking a benchmark on where they are right now, but leaving flexibility for improvements and changes into the narrative as they go ahead. Commercial offices, so with a typical net gross ratio of 70 kilowatt hours per meter squared of net lettable area per year, is equivalent to 55 kilowatt hours per meter square of gross internal average per year. Building owners and developers are recommended to target a base building rating of 6 stars using BBP's Design for Performance process, which is essentially based on NABERS, more of a UK kind of stamp on that. And we covered NABERS in a previous presentation. Again, I'll put a link in the description. Whole life carbon, at this stage we're not covering that, but it's recognised that operational emissions represent only one aspect of net zero carbon in new buildings. We talked about embodied carbon as an example. Reducing whole life carbon is crucial and will be covered in a separate guidance. Once that comes out, you'll be sure that we will obviously provide some intel on that. Adaptation to climate change. So net zero carbon buildings should also be adapted to climate change. It is essential that the risk of overheating is managed and that cooling is minimised. Okay. So just moving across to kind of the players who are involved with this. I said it's CIBSE as the lead, but actually there's a lot more really interesting and good businesses involved in this. You've got LETI, which is the London Energy Transformation Initiative. We've got UK GBP. Mentioned there BBP in terms of their kind of flavour on NABERS, but better building partnerships. We've got Good Homes Alliance, RIBA Architecture. Now, anyone who's in our industry for things like MSI and buildings and BMS, mechanical, electrical, tier 1, tier 2 infrastructure management, all will be very wary of, very aware of RIBA, specifically the stages in terms of how much information gets put into these different stages. But really interesting that these are involved in this. So we should anticipate that moving forward. The mere fact that both RIBA and CIBSE are involved is that some of these terminologies that we're seeing now will be incorporated into specifications moving forward. So that's the infographic. There is other information that we're going to tease upon. So let's talk about the definitions. Net zero carbon, operational energy. So how do we define, if we take the operational carbon mantra, what can we distill it down to? So this is the statement, right? A net zero carbon operational energy asset, so building, is one where no fossil fuels are used, all energy use has been minimized, meets the local energy use target, for example, kilowatt hours per square meter per annum, which we talked about with the EUI, and all energy use is generated on or off-site using renewables that demonstrate additionally. Direct emissions from renewables and any upstream emissions are offset. So that's that kind of detail at really high level from 1,000 mile high, looking down at what you want to achieve as a really high level. But we mentioned local energy use targets there. What do we mean by that? Well, I prefaced before when we looked at kind of, it was only really mentioning schools, it was mentioning commercial offices, and it mentioned residential. So local targets, in order for relevant for various countries. In the UK, the main sources of local energy use targets currently are the LETI one-pager, and I've got a link to that to share in a second, which aligns with RIBA 2030 challenge of a 2030 target. The LETI energy targets for new buildings aim to ensure that by 2050, UK building energy use would not exceed available renewable energy. So the total capacity of use in the UK from the grid will be less than the total generated via other means, right? Renewable, wind, solar, etc. In offices and some non-domestic buildings, energy rating can also be used. So the DEC display energy certificate, which is rated at B or above, or UK NABERS 6, which is the top level that you can achieve for NABERS. And there is the link there for that one pager if you want to look a little bit more into that. But what happens if there's no local energy targets for my building type? We mentioned commercial buildings, we mentioned residential, we mentioned schools. So CIBSE, LETI and RIBA and other industry bodies are working together, and it is expected that in the future consensus will grow on energy targets for other sectors. But there are other sectors that are already starting to provide. So some sectors developing their own, things like Department for Education, School Output Specification, Annex 2H Energy, the upcoming NHS Net Zero Standard, I'm looking forward to that coming out, and the upcoming Scottish Futures Trust Net Zero Public Sector Building Standard. So for obvious reasons, LETI and both CIBSE will make sure that they look for the guidance on that and make sure where possible they all align. In the interim though, for targeting buildings that don't sit within the current framework of the EUI, a similar approach to sectors can be taken. So energy use equivalent is equivalent to achieving passive house with a heat pump. Alternatively, a target of the display energy certificate of B or above could be used. However, how demanding it will vary in different sectors, and some cases it may not be ambitious enough. Obviously, they want to keep pushing for more. What type of energy targets should a building meet? So we talked about the space heating demand. So this is the active heat input required to heat a building, right? It's influenced by many factors: internal games, fabric, passive design, heat recovery on the ventilations. It is independent of the heating system type and efficiency, which meets that demand. Now, typically, the calculation for this is looking at the difference between your heat requirements. So in a typical building, it might be you heat to 19 and you'll cool to 22. And if you've got a difference of about 2 or 3 degrees to heat the space, well, that's a delta of about 2 or 3 degrees. You're multiplying that by your heating system efficiency. Now, that is usually, without getting really super technical, is something called a coefficient of performance, a COP. It is how much input power do you have to put in from pure electricity versus how much heating or cooling output you get, also measured in kilowatts. So, you might get an air source heat pump where you put 1 kilowatt of power from electricity and you'll get 3 kilowatts of heat out. Relatively efficient system, right? It's not certainly 1-to-1. So that calculation is the space heating demand, which is measured in kilowatt hours per square meter per year. We also have the same for the cooling demand, which will look for things like chillers, air conditioning, etc. Energy use intensity, so the EUI, again, is same measurement, kilowatt hours per square meter per annum. The energy use per square meter that is required by a building over a year included regulated, so domestic hot water, space heating, cooling, lighting, ventilation, and unregulated loads, things that you can't manage or manage from a system like a BMS system like lifts and IT, etc. It's a measurement of the building's performance and therefore includes all energy supplies to the building, whether from the grid or on-site systems. And then, another way to energy targets should a building meet is energy ratings, right? And again, we mentioned a display energy certificate, which is a DEC, usually look for a B or above, and NABERS rating, ideally aim for 6, which is beyond excellent. They can vary with factors such as occupancy, density, and weather, and provide a scale rather than a single target. NABERS allows landlords and tenants area to be rated separately, which is really good. What if we have an existing building and are trying to reach net zero? Well, let's look at some sub-definitions. So, to understand, if you are a building that you're trying to get on the ladder, you're trying to understand, you're nervous about the future in terms of legislation. So what can we do? In all these cases, the claim of net zero in progress can only be made if you've started a plan, can you start to profess that you're on the ladder? Has the building done everything in its control at this point in time in terms of meeting your net zero target? So removed all fossil fuels, provided regenerative technologies where you can, all of that kind of stuff. Has that been done? Have you committed to a PPA agreement or some off-site energy regenerative technologies like a solar farm as an example? And is there a committed plan with a time frame to meet all of these requirements? So for time, where a project is targeting net zero and actions relevant to its stage have been undertaken, but the project stage is not yet advanced enough for all requirements to be achievable. In existing buildings, where existing buildings do not yet meet net zero energy targets, but the building has a net zero retrofit plan in place to meet those targets. So you can say you are net zero in progress if you have a plan in place. And district energy schemes, so typically if a district energy scheme is under the policy of or is under the supply from a provider of energy that is using fossil fuels, that is difficult, right? Because you are under the remit of whatever they're supplying. But if there's a plan in place, again, over time with these stringent measures, then that plan will also count as a net zero in progress as long as that plan is in place. What happens and how do you start to build a plan? So a net zero retrofit plan for existing buildings should include, right? So if we're starting off, if you're a building that is starting to get serious about this, there are a number of key stakeholders involved who are pushing this. Well, this is where you need to start, right? Key building information. So putting a plan together, and we as Global Associates, it's part of what we do. So we help organisations build these plans and help execute and commit them and submit them to the to CIBSE and the Net Zero operational challenge. So key building information, constraints, risks and opportunities. We've got to document all of that. The key works proposed along with related strategies and details. So what projects or energy conservation measures do we look at in terms of piecing these all together? Is that solar? Is that driving down efficiencies through the BMS systems? Is it putting in an EMS to manage and track changes? All of these things put together, what does that look like as a roadmap for execution? Again, we touched on that. Associated energy modelling showing the energy targets will be met. Again, our EMS platform does the forecasting, shows you what or regression analysis shows what that energy looks like prior on data pre-energy conservation measure, and then post looking at how it should be affected with these different things. And it's a really powerful tool. Again, the link will be in the description for access to that presentation and demonstration. Sequence of works. So how will you set out on this escapade of putting all of these different plans together for these executions, and in what sequence? Important. Are you going for the quick wins first, or are you going for the regenerative technologies first? Sorry, put my teeth back in. in how you want to piece these together. And again, we can help kind of look at what that looks like. A plan for monitoring and reporting energy usage. Talked about that. What are the financial and business implications? For example, energy bills for future consumers, how capital will be made available for such ventures, tracking your progress via an EMS platform, commitments to implementation and a timeline for implementation in steps or as a one-off. Now we can help piece all of this together. If you need some consultation on how to start this, obviously you can see here, this was a net zero operational carbon presentation. It's a high level at this stage. There is a lot more to dive into. I didn't want to kind of make this, 2 hours long, but there is lots of information. I've posted links in the description if you want. If you want to get hold of my good self or anyone in the team, maybe you're starting that journey and you want some more advice, or you want a presentation or something individual to use as an organization, then please, reach out. More than happy to kind of start that ball rolling and seeing what we can do for you. But in the meantime, let me know what you think, and I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.